Good afternoon. My name is William Bill Martin, and I have the pleasure of directing the Baker Institute Drug Policy Program. I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar, The Age of Addiction, How Bad Habits Became Big Business. Our solo presenter this afternoon is the author of a fascinating book by that title, David Courtwright, Professor Emeritus, Presidential Professor, and Distinguished Professor of History at the University of North Florida, where he taught medical, U.S., and world history and won an impressive slate of awards for both his teaching and his research, including 2 National Endowment Award fellowships, National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. David's 7 books include Forces of Habit, Drugs and the Making of the Modern World, Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America, Addicts Who Survived, An Oral History of Narcotic Use in America. In addition, of course, he has written a number of articles related to drug use and misuse and drug policies, helpful and hurtful, past and present. I assure you that he is not only a prolific writer, he's a really good writer. After you've heard his presentation, I think you'll want to stay on your computer and order that book. Personally, I'm pleased that we have been friends since I served on his dissertation committee when he received his PhD in history from Rice in 1979. Welcome back, David.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. And thank you for serving on my dissertation committee back in 1979. Speaking of the past, I began my early career studying addiction, and in particular, drug addiction. And I think everyone understands, if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, that it was basically about heroin and cocaine. There were a few enlightened public health types who thought of addiction in terms of alcohol and tobacco and other illicit drugs, but that was basically it. However, something has happened in the last 40 years, and that is there's been a growth in our conception of addiction. We have more types of addiction. Many people think that there's been an intensification of addiction, that addiction has become more commonplace, and it's not just about drugs anymore. So digitized gambling is said to be an addiction. Pornography online is something that's generated a lot of research in terms of addiction. Food addiction is a very thriving scholarly field, and it's obviously a huge public health issue. Vaping has emerged in the last few years. Digital addictions have become huge. Netflix even has a documentary, The Social Dilemma, which is currently running. One even reads about compulsive tanning as a form of addiction. And you just didn't hear these things 30 or 40 years ago. China even has boot camps for young people who've become compulsive gamers. And believe me, if you end up in one of these boot camps, it is not good for your social credit score in China. So when I began researching these proliferating addictions, I found a common thread. And that common thread I call limbic capitalism. And by limbic capitalism, I'm referring to a socially regressive business system that operates often with the help of complicit governments and sometimes even with the help of criminal organizations. And what it's about is encouraging excessive consumption and addiction. That's really the core of it. And what you see here is the face of limbic capitalism in 1969. This is a professional gambler who was looking down on the casino floor through a one-way mirror, and he's looking for card counters and cheaters among the tourist masses who are waiting like sheep ready to be sheared at the gaming tables on the casino floor. But if you think about it, you can imagine that in 1979, you can imagine Ray Kroc contemplating McDonald's customers in a similar fashion. Or if you go to 1989, you can think about Philip Morris executives studying Marlboro smokers in this fashion, or even in 2019, Juul executives eyeing teenage vapors and figuring out how they can expand that market. So there's a common pattern here, and the common pattern is that entrepreneurs are looking for products and services that provide a quick hit of brain reward. And they grow their businesses by basically reinforcing and spreading the habits that are based on these quick hits of brain reward. So what's limbic? Why limbic capitalism? Well, limbic capitalism refers to the limbic region of your brain, which is associated with pleasure and motivation and long-term memory and other basic survival functions that are linked to our emotions. You need your limbic system, but unfortunately, your limbic system can also be exploited by other people in a way that's not good for you. And the reason that limbic capitalism is potentially a problem, or in fact is actually a problem, is that it undermines our appetite control. That's what the key issue is here. Often the harms that it does to us are lethal. In the book, I calculate that for every death due to homicide or violence, there are 30 premature deaths due to bad habits like smoking or overeating or distracted driving. Now that's globally. That's based on my analysis of World Health Organization data. That's not just in the United States. Here is another unpleasant statistical reality. You know, I think that limbic capitalism gets its hooks into us early, that this pathological learning is something that starts early in life. There's deliberate targeting of children. And I like, instead of using the word addiction, I often think of addiction in terms of this phrase, pathological learning. And if you think about that, when does learning start? It really begins very early in life. And that's well understood by limbic capitalists. And it's literally the case when young minds are trained early in harmful behaviors. So my goal in writing this book was to try to figure out how pathological learning became a business model. I mean, we've always had pathological learning. We've always had addiction, but it's hit or miss. It really wasn't that central, I think, to the human experience until the last 400 or 500 years. And so to trace the global origins of limbic capitalism, I wrote a global history of pleasure, vice, and addiction. That's really the key move in the book. I decided I couldn't just write about addiction. There are countless books on addiction, but if you want to get the story right, you've got to look also at the larger context of pleasure and vice and how those things interact. And this is a diagram that suggests a way in which they interact. Vice is typically a subset of pleasure, and addiction is typically a subset of vice. As a rule, people do not develop bad or destructive habits unless they initially are exposed to some form of brain reward. And generally, it is vice activities that provide the most intense brain reward. And in fact, in virtually any society, people are more likely to label something as a vice if it has this potential for addiction. That's one. It's not the only element, but that's one of the elements that goes into our deciding what constitutes a vice. It's addictive potential. Another way to say this is that really an addiction is a vice that has become unusually strong, unusually preoccupying, unusually destructive, both to the individual and to society. Now, to round out this scheme, I've added a fourth category, which I call contested pleasures. And I think it's pretty obvious why I did that, because pleasure and vice and addiction are socially as well as biologically determined. And there's this zone of contested activities that are somewhere between vice and legitimate pleasure, and people have different opinions about them. So, for example, in Europe and the Americas, I would argue that the consumption of sugar-rich foods in many places is beginning to become a vice that is linked to a number of deadly diseases On the other hand, you can name a traditional vice, namely cannabis smoking, that is becoming in many places a contested pleasure. So that there's a kind of fluidity here. You're not necessarily stuck in one category. Generally speaking, vices will vary with time and technology. That's why I think the only way you can understand this is historically. These things are not static. They're not simply biologically determined. They evolve over time. Simple example, drinking alcohol. When water was impure, drinking alcohol, especially beer, was a good idea. It was something that was many people regarded as salubrious. However, with public health reform, when water became much safer, then maybe drinking alcohol is not such a good idea. And in fact, one of the early moves or public relations tactics of the temperance movement was to build drinking fountains in cities. And these fountains would often have temperance messages emblazoned on them. And the message was, here, drink the water is fine. In this particular photograph, this is the East Village in New York City in the year 1904. You can see mother and children lining up for a drink of water. Now, technological and business innovations largely determine the number of pleasures, vices, and addictions. When pleasures expand, so do the number of vices, and when vices expand, so do the number of addictions. That's the general historical model. Basically, you can't get more of the one without getting more of the others. And if you take away nothing else from the webinar today, I would like for you to take away the image of 4 balloons. Imagine that addictions, vices, contested pleasures, and pleasures are balloons. And imagine that they're embedded one within the other. And then imagine that you have all 4 of these things up to your lips. And then you blow on them so that they all expand simultaneously. And that's what I think has happened with technology in history and business enterprise. There's been a steady expansion of all 4 of these spheres, and you really can't have the one without the other. All right, so this is just a heuristic device. What does the book look like in narrative form? Well, it looks like this, and this is self-consciously big history or deep history. It starts in prehistory, and it argues that the development, the expansion of pleasures, vices, and addictions is something that for a long time was a gradual and fortuitous process. But the pace quickened in the early modern era, in the 17th and 18th century especially, and then it quickened again in the 19th and 20th century with industrialization and urbanization. And even though by that time you also had very significant transnational opposition, the slide here is a poster for an international conference and exhibition about the dangers of alcoholism, which was held in The Hague in 1911. Even though you had significant transnational reform opposition against commercialized vice by the early 20th century, ultimately the pro-vice interests prevailed on most of their political and policy issues, with some exceptions, which I'll talk about later. I don't want to give you the impression that it's impossible to fight back against globalized limbic capitalism, although it is difficult, and we'll talk about some of the policy options toward the end. But first, let me illustrate one key idea from each chapter. So what I want to do in the first part of this webinar is just take a sort of a jet airplane trip over the argument in the book with the help of some illustrations, and then open it up for Q&A. So for the first chapter, I've chosen Paul Cézanne's famous painting, The Card Players, which is familiar, I'm sure, to most of you. And this was painted in the early 1890s. And it shows peasants, workers on the estate of Cézanne's father near Aix. And it seems quintessentially French. You look at this and you think, oh, of course, this is French. But then when you take a second look and you start thinking about the objects in this painting, you realize that the painting is actually, in a way, a metaphor for the confluence of the world's pleasure resources. So they're playing cards. Where do the cards come? The cards come from Korean and Chinese prototypes. They're smoking tobacco in pipes. Where does the tobacco come from? It comes from plants that were indigenous to the New World. There's a backgammon game on the table. Where did that come from? It came from race games that originated, as near as we can tell, in ancient Mesopotamia. There's even an olive jar in the upper left-hand corner of the canvas. Where did the olives come from? Well, originally they came from Asia Minor, even though by the late 19th century, they were commonplace in southern France. So you have this spread of resources, which again is epitomized in this particular canvas. And by the way, there's something else that's going on here. Art historians have spent an incredible amount of time debating the expressions on the sitters in this particular painting. I have a simple explanation for what they're doing. I think they're gambling, and that would explain the intense look on their faces and also Cézanne's choice of a tavern-like setting. Now, the playing cards in the Cézanne canvas were originally made by hand centuries before, and then they were printed with woodblock process, and then by the time he painted the canvas, they were made with steam presses. And steam machinery plus cheap ingredients plus cheap labor, that was the formula for the great leap forward in mass addiction, which occurs in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. And in this case, it's not only cheap labor, it's cheap female labor. What you're looking at in this illustration is an 1859 British patent drawing. And it's a way of making cheap cigars. It's a conveyor belt system that wraps and compresses the leaves into the cigars. And in 1881, an American patented another device. His name was James Bonsack. He came up with a similar machine to make cigarettes. And his original Bonsack machine could spit out 200 cigarettes made from flue-cured tobacco every minute. Very, very addictive technology, obviously. But what interests me is that by 1930, there were German variants of the original Bonsack machine that could spit out 1,800 cigarettes per minute, which, if you stop and think about it, is a 9-fold increase in productivity over a period of 50 years. So it's not coincidental that it's in this time period when you get this real intensification of what some historians call packaged pleasures, everything from chewing gum to ice cream, obviously packages of cigarettes. It's also the era of the first risque movies, candy bars, all kinds of things that produce brain reward are being churned out, and they're through mass production, and they're being mass marketed to more and more people. Now, even before industrialization, critics were pointing to these new pleasure-giving commodities, and they were raising charges of addiction, even though they didn't use the word addiction. That addiction is pretty much a 20th century term. Instead, they often spoke of some form of slavery. Tobacco smokers, for example, were said to be so confirmed in their habit that they had a hook in their heart. Or dram drinkers, or those who were compulsive card players, were said to be like slaves, or even more specifically, like African slaves. And this idea of slavery was very important, and people realized that not only could you as a consumer become enslaved to these new pleasurable commodities, but producers of these commodities could be and were enslaved. The most obvious example being the slave plantations, which is why, for example, many anti-slavery Quakers boycotted sugar. Sugar, what's wrong with sugar? Well, it's produced on plantations in the West Indies that are run by slave labor. By the late 19th century, commercialized vice and rising addiction, which are the calling cards of limbic capitalism, provoked organized transnational opposition. That's the subject of the fourth chapter, Anti-Vice Activism. Initially, much of the reform energy came, as you would imagine, from evangelical Protestants and globe-trotting missionaries. Later, it became more of a secular reform movement. A number of prominent physicians and scientists became involved, and that trend continued into the 20th century. And both the religious and the secular reformers were concerned with the public and medical dimension of commercialized vice. It wasn't something that was simply bad for your soul or something that ruined your character. It was something that posed a real threat to society. And an obvious example of that would be something like prostitution, which of course was a reservoir of venereal disease. This is Lieutenant John Dannenhauer, who was a victim of this particular disease. He was a very talented U.S. Navy officer and an Arctic explorer. And in 1887, he killed himself after he accidentally grounded a ship. The reason he grounded the ship is because he was losing his eyesight as a consequence of having acquired syphilis earlier in his life. He left behind a wife, 2 children, and a suicide note pinned to his lapel. Heavy drinking, a master vice targeted by reformers, undermined individual responsibility, killed innocent people, and destroyed state and private property. And that's really a focus of a lot of the anti-vice activism in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. Alcohol was, in the eyes of many reformers, the master vice. This bibulous fellow is literally asleep at the switch. This is where we get the expression that we still use. And he, as the caption says, he is neglecting his professional responsibilities and other people are dying as a consequence. This is actually part of a series of posters that were published by the Spanish government, and other posters in the series depicted an epileptic child who had been sired by a father who was a drunkard. And so that's another important idea, namely that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children through their indulgence in these vice activities. So what do you do about this? Well, one solution was to severely restrict access to alcohol or drugs or other commercialized vices, or even to outlaw them altogether. And in fact, prohibition was a widespread global experiment in the early 20th century. When you hear the word prohibition and alcohol, you automatically think of the United States, but no. This is something that was tried in many countries in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Then, in the mid-20th century, anti-vice activism faded. Prohibition schemes, of course, entailed their own costs, black markets, adulterated products, crime, corruption, contempt for the law, you know the list. And governments, frankly, were ambivalent about vice suppression. Governments, on the one hand, recognized that there were tremendous social costs generated by commercialized vice. On the other hand, they also knew that these were potentially tremendous sources of revenue, which was important in times of depression and rearmament and global war. Taxing vices or taking a cut of the vices in some way, shape, or form was very attractive to modernizing and imperialistic states. That was true even of the Nazis. The Nazis had a reputation, deserved, for being strongly opposed to vice. So the official party line on tobacco was that it's bad for you. The Nazis sterilized alcoholics. The Nazis had a very hardline policy on narcotic drugs. But they allowed lotteries. So in 1938 and 1939, they consolidated the state lotteries. They created a national lottery and said, okay, you can play the lottery, provided that no Jews buy tickets and provided that the proceeds from the lottery go to Nazi sanctioned charities. Although it turns out that when Germany launched into World War II, many of the profits were actually raked off for the Wehrmacht, and proceeds from the so-called winter help or winter relief lottery were going to support the war effort. So what happened when states decided not to tax or otherwise legalize vice and they stuck to their prohibitionist guns? The answer, of course, is you get organized criminal activity. And big money brought rationalization. So just as licit vice enterprises became rationalized, so too did illicit vice enterprises. And Mexican drug syndicates are an excellent example of this. They learned to either buy insurance or simply to write off failed smuggling attempts as the price of doing business. Here you see a Jeep Cherokee that's hung up on a border fence. And, so what? You can go out and get another Jeep Cherokee. Trafficking syndicates would even abandon tractor trailers in the United States once their loads had been successfully delivered. So they just leave a tractor trailer with a load of onions or something parked by the side of the road and help yourself to the onions because the really valuable merchandise has been removed and it's not worth taking it back on the other side of the border. You all know that the Mexican syndicates also expanded their business globally. They expanded their supply lines south to the Andes and west to China. They expanded their distribution networks east to Europe and to Africa and north throughout the United States, including to many parts of the United States that had not previously had significant traffic in hard drugs like heroin or methamphetamine. Just about the only thing that the traffickers couldn't do was to legally advertise their products, but that was something that pharma could and did do. And a well-known example in the United States is the very aggressive promotion of opioid analgesics for non-cancer pain, even as opioid manufacturers and distributors were turning a blind eye to the diversion of large amounts of oxycodone and hydrocodone through internet pharmacies, pill mills, and dope doctors. Here you see the results of that. These are CDC data, which show that basically the number of prescription opioid addicts moved in lockstep with the increase in illicit supply in the first decade of the 21st century, although subsequently many of those people who became addicted to prescription opioids in the early 2000s switched to heroin or fentanyl or heroin mixed with fentanyl, or in some cases, fentanyl analogs, which are even more dangerous. But you're probably familiar with that story, so I thought I would take a look at another legal product, food. What if food, specifically food that is engineered with sugar, salt, and fat, acts like a drug? What if it's just another type of drug? This is an idea, along with the related concept of food addiction, that has actually gained a lot of currency in scientific circles since 2007. Now let me be clear that food addiction and obesity are not the same thing. If somebody's overweight, that doesn't mean that they're an addict or anything like that. And in fact, given the prevalence of purging disorders, there are some people who are food addicts who are not overweight at all. But we know from a variety of studies that approximately a quarter or more of all people who are obese meet the clinical criteria for food addiction, which is to say they are preoccupied with food, they experience very strong cravings for food, they go on binges, they lose control, they become physically sick, and they become disgusted with themselves. One of the chief cheerleaders for the concept of food addiction is Dr. Nora Volkow. And those of you who are part of the drug policy group at the Baker Institute will recognize Dr. Volkow as the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And then maybe you're kind of scratching your head, well, what's the director of a drug abuse agency doing in the field of food addiction? Actually, she spends a lot of time on food addiction. And the reason for that is that she and her colleagues are after really big game. They understand that there are many behaviors, not just compulsive drug taking, that are linked to the preventable morbidity and mortality that is such a characteristic of modern industrial societies. And they're trying to find a general scientific explanation for why there's so much of that premature illness and death in our world that is preventable and yet is tied to compulsive behavior. I'm interested in the same question, obviously, in the book, only I'm not coming at it from the standpoint strictly of neurochemistry, which is what they're doing, but I'm looking more at the economic and technological and historical and marketing aspect of the story. In any event, Volkow's point, and my point too, is that dead is dead, whether it's from lung cancer or diabetes or a drug overdose. I mean, the public health stakes here are simply enormous. Now, Volkow and her allies hold that certain foods act like drugs insofar as they produce burst release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in a way that activates the brain's reward pathways. And repeated stimulation with these substances increases tolerance to and ultimately dependence on the stimulus, whether it's a food or a drug or a behavior like gambling. Dopamine receptor loss occurs not only in the reward pathway, but also in the frontal regions that are connected to it, which undermines self-discipline and self-control. So you, in a sense, you can think of addiction as being like a brain workout in reverse. It tends to diminish self-control. And not only that, but over time, the neurochemical changes reduce the amount of pleasure that you derive from the stimulus. So there are two things that are going on here as a result of these neurochemical changes. You're not only developing tolerance and experiencing the downregulation of dopamine receptors, but you're actually experiencing less pleasure from whatever it was that turned you on originally. Now that seems strange. Why would you persist in doing something that is very bad for you and not much fun anyway, or at least increasingly less fun? Well, the answer to that question is fascinating. It turns out that our brains also release dopamine when we encounter the cues that are associated with these activities. So in other words, we respond to conditioned stimuli like all organisms, which helps to explain the persistence of bad habits and why limbic capitalists find it so easy to keep us on their particular consumption treadmills. Anything that increases dopamine in our motivational circuitry sustains the drive to perform the behaviors that are necessary to receive the reward, even though at the same time, the intensity of the reward itself is diminishing. So the way this is often expressed is that you can continue to want a thing even after you have ceased liking it. And despite the life-threatening and life-shortening consequences of that particular behavior. So grocery stores, let's talk about grocery stores. Grocery stores are lousy with cues. And when you look at this particular slide, your eye goes to the poor woman pushing the cart. But what I see when I think about limbic capitalism, I tend to look at the merchandise on the shelves, and I recognize that these are not simply products. These are blended products that are scientifically engineered to produce maximum brain reward. There's nothing accidental about the 20 or 30 ingredients that go into the chips and the other products you see on the shelf, nor is there anything accidental about the arrangement of these products on the shelf. I mean, these are set up in such a way so that often, the dip will be right next to the chips, so that if you buy the chips, oh, you've got to have the dip to go with it, and so you better get some of that too. It's all very carefully thought out. Another way to say that is that blending is really important in understanding the development and the success of limbic capitalism. It's not just a story of this product or that innovation. It's how you blend these things together to create unique hedonic environments that are rich in these cues that lead to very heavy consumption, the extreme form of which is addiction. All right, so blending. You want a more addictive cigarette. Well, add ammonia. Another example, you want to sell more vaping products to teens. Add fruity flavors. If you want, for example, to sell more dietary supplements, you can add steroids or even sildenafil, which is generic Viagra, and hope that the FDA doesn't catch you, which it usually doesn't. You want to sell more candy and cookies, you add cannabis. I guess if cannabis flavored or cannabis infused Tostitos ever become a thing, this lady is in even more trouble than she is now. Limbic capitalism's harms can also be subtle. Can you become conditioned to excessive or even addictive use of your smartphone? You bet you can. Will it kill you? Probably not, unless of course you're texting while you're driving, or you step into an open manhole or something when you like me, you're walking down the street and you've got your smartphone in front of your face. Yet heavy use, particularly heavy juvenile use, can enmesh you in a world of perpetual distraction, celebrity idolatry, pornographic sex, malicious gossip, cyberbullying, anxiety, insomnia. There are all kinds of harms and distractions that come with this, and not the least of which is intellectual stultification. So this is a famous photograph. It went viral in 2014, showing Dutch students in the Rijksmuseum sitting in front of the Night Watch, Rembrandt's The Night Watch, and they're buried in their smartphones. And when this first came out, there was this lively internet debate. People were saying, oh no, you're misinterpreting this. Don't you understand that the Rijksmuseum has a really excellent app, and that these students are just learning more about Rembrandt by clicking on the app, and they're getting additional information? Well, that's a testable hypothesis. And I happened to be in Amsterdam in 2017, and I visited the Rijksmuseum, and I went to the exact spot where this photograph was taken. And I looked over the shoulders of 14 randomly chosen students of the same age and posture. And I'm here to tell you that with one exception, it was social media all the way down. When I published The Age of Addiction in 2019, I thought that the main source of inefficiency in higher education was digital distraction. At that point, I'd had a 40-year career in higher education, and I thought that digital technology had reached the point where it was interfering with note-taking and composition and focused study and other traditional forms of learning. And it was, in fact, the biggest problem that I faced in trying to get history across to students. I admit that the pandemic has forced me to rethink that view. It's obviously the case that digital technology also threw us a lifeline during the spring, during the onset of the pandemic crisis. And I certainly have zoomed into classes around the country to talk about this book and other books. And I see tremendous potential in the technology, which could improve and could realize that potential over time. So I think maybe the jury is still out on that one. However, I think we need to recognize that there's still another problem that remains, and that is that the internet is very much enmeshed in the world of bad habits. You learn about bad habits on the internet. Education, if you stop and think about it, education is traditionally associated with upward mobility, and bad habits are traditionally associated with downward mobility. And the internet is nothing if not about providing instruction in vice, not only new vices like vaping, but old vices like gambling or prostitution or drinking alcohol. So what you see in this particular slide is an unusual billboard, which I encountered when I was walking down the street in Lincoln, England in 2010. This is a floodlit billboard that is outside of a liquor store, and it's advertising cheap internet booze. And I was immediately reminded of what I in the book I call the 5 A's of mass addiction, which I've labeled in this slide: accessibility, affordability, advertising, anonymity, and anomie. And then, of course, because it's a billboard, you have advertising, and it's also making cheap booze available and very convenient, very easy to get to. You don't even have to go into the liquor store. It can just be delivered to you at home. And there's also implicit in this, I think, also is anomie, insofar as one of the messages in this particular advertisement is basically, if you're lonely and blue, we have a cheap internet accessible booze date for you. In 2020, exactly 10 years after I encountered the Booze for Less billboard, the idea of alcohol sales on the internet seemed prescient. I mean, wow, it's like, okay, now we've got a pandemic, and suddenly lots of people are ordering their alcohol online, and they're cooped up and they're bored and they have more reason to drink. I have done some research in this area, and the general finding is that the pandemic has made the internet even more important as a locus for pleasure, vice, and addiction, while simultaneously dealing a terrific economic blow to traditional brick and mortar venues like casinos. Vegas casinos have lost much of their business, for example, to online gambling or online sports betting. And some of them have even been forced to go into the internet gambling business themselves. If you can't beat them, join them. All right. So given both the ubiquity of the internet and the growing availability of inexpensive pleasures, vices, and addictive substances and pastimes, is there anything that we can do about this limbic capitalist juggernaut? The last chapter of the book, which is called Against Excess, which is a nod to the title of a book by the late Mark Kleiman, argues that the cause is not hopeless. And I think I'm just going to give you one or two quick examples, and then again, I want to move on to the discussion. The best example is the global counteroffensive against combustible tobacco products like cigarettes. When the tobacco industry encountered significant opposition in advanced industrial societies like the United States or Britain, it started selling its product in more vulnerable markets with less sophisticated public health structures, started expanding globally. The global public health establishment pushed back hard and with some success. in the late 20th and the early 21st centuries. And it wasn't just a matter of tax policy or regulation. One of the things that really struck me as I was doing the research is how effective ridicule can be. You know, when we think about policy, we often think about laws or regulations or taxation or something like that. But there's more than one way to skin a cat. And one way you can do it is by mobilizing the power of ridicule, which exposes the parasitism and the hypocrisy and the deceit behind limbic capitalism. So one of the examples that I like to use is the story of Bugga Up. Bugga Up stands for Billboard Utilizing Graffitists Against Unhealthy Promotions, which is a phrase that doesn't come tripping off the tongue, but it's Bugga Up for short. And Bugga Up is also a pun. In Australian slang, it refers to screwing something up. And what got screwed up in this case was billboards. Bugga Up was founded in 1978. The activists targeted billboards. And for example, there was a popular Australian cigarette brand called Winfield. So there would be a billboard for, you know, have a Winfield. And then people would alter it with spray paint. And so have a Winfield became have a wank. And if you don't know what a wank is, I'm not going to tell you, at least not under the august auspices of a Baker Institute webinar. Anyway, it worked. I mean, this mix of cheeky populism and civil disobedience was a winner in Australia. And in 1992, the Australian government banned all alcohol advertising. I'm sorry, not alcohol advertising, all cigarette advertising, except at the point of sale. So I'm going to close my part of the presentation with the words of the man in this photograph. He is a surgeon. His name is Arthur Chesterfield Evans. In addition to being a thoracic surgeon, he is an activist. And in 1983, Dr. Chesterfield Evans gave a defiant speech in front of a billboard in Sydney, Australia. And he said the following. He said, after 6 years of surgery, I could accept that people suffer and die. But I had real trouble coming to terms with the idea that cigarette diseases were the result of cold-blooded and systematic deception waged by moneyed interests against less informed consumers. And after he spoke those words, he took his can of spray paint, he shook it, he climbed up, and then he spray painted legal drug pushers, the real criminals on the billboard. And then this cheering, placard waving crowd joined in, and they covered that billboard from top to bottom with mocking graffiti. Interestingly, the police were looking on. This whole crowd was surrounded by police observers, and they did not intervene in this action of civil disobedience. Now, all of this happened back in 1983, and a generation later, we are still very much, in fact, probably even more so, in a situation where moneyed interests systematically deceived less informed consumers, especially those with low levels of education and social status. That's still the way the world is. The question that confronts us is, what are we going to do about it? Are we, like Dr. Chesterfield Evans, going to have the courage and the wit to say no to limbic capitalism and the business of bad habits? I will now take questions. Before I do, I would like to thank the individuals and the institutions that helped me with the research for this book. You see them named here. I'd like to thank the Baker Institute for sponsoring this presentation. And now I'll turn over the webinar to Dr. Martin.
Thank you so much, David. That's very enjoyable there and certainly informative. I'm going to start here with a couple of questions that I had them, and there's more coming in. Here we are. There are a couple of questions came in about anorexia, and you touched on that just a bit. But I put that, says, to start, this is from, oh no, it's the wrong one. I'm sorry about this, but I don't think this was taken down. Anyway, the question was about anorexia, and just said, how can you say how it fits your model? And here's, I can't find the question that was about that, but in any case, person was.
Let me just briefly say that what I tried to clarify is that paradoxically, you can be anorexic and you can have purging disorders and be preoccupied with food. You can show many of the clinical signs of food addiction, but because of the purging behavior, you're not necessarily obese. And so that's actually a fairly commonplace observation in that literature. So I just wanted to make the point that when we're talking about compulsive eating disorders, I wasn't just equating that with obesity. That's all.
No, that was understood. This person was asking, I'm sorry it disappeared, but she was talking about the problems that people go through with, talking about the difficulties to friends and family when these people were on a weight loss journey, and
yes,
and just talking about the addictive anorexia as an addiction.
And here's another piece of evidence that's also cited by those who want to consider food addiction to be a genuine addiction. There are many organizations that are modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous to help people with eating disorders. And in fact, they use much of the same terminology that's used in AA meetings is applied to their eating disorders.
Here's one from Dr. Thomas Blocher, who wants to ask you if you'd like to comment on the Sackler family, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, and the FDA approval of OxyContin. I'm certain you have ideas, you have thoughts on it.
Sure. So I shied away from opioid addiction for a couple of reasons. I will say that I am an expert witness in the opioid litigation, actually in a number of states, both the federal litigation and in state litigation. And so there are certain things I really shouldn't go into for reasons of confidentiality. However, in the book, I'll tell you what I say in the book. I do see the Sackler family as fitting into this model of limbic capitalist entrepreneurship, and not just the members of the family who sold us OxyContin, but if you go back to Arthur Sackler, who's kind of the founding figure in this dynasty, there were other psychoactive medications that he helped promote, such as Valium, which was widely overused in the 1960s and 1970s. So that this pattern is by no means confined to opioid analgesics.
Okay, here's one. The person wants to ask about, what do you see the differences? What role has religion played in dealing with various vices? And do you see differences between Protestant and Catholic Christians in the way they have approached certain vices?
So that's a great question for a variety of reasons. So the most ardent anti-vice activists in the 19th century were Protestant missionaries, and especially if, as was often the case, they also had medical training. They saw the physical side of commercialized vice, they saw the spiritual side, and they really were at the forefront. But of course, Catholics, if you read the Catholic Catechism, it's full of language about the virtues of temperance and the evils of vicious behavior. So it's not like Protestants have a monopoly on anti-vice activism. But it was pointed out to me when I was writing the manuscript that this is really a two-way street, because there's a secularizing dimension to limbic capitalism. If you think about Las Vegas casinos and social media and increased alcohol consumption and all of these commercialized vice activities, they're going to undermine religion. They're going to create worldly distractions. And to the extent that religion is undermined, it becomes even more, it becomes even easier for limbic capitalists to operate in that kind of an environment. There's a line in the book, if God is dead, any product is possible. And so there's literally a vicious circle here, that to the extent that limbic capitalism is secularizing and eroding organized religion and distracting people from pious activities, it is enhancing the conditions that would lead to its commercial success.
Here's one from Dr. Carl Romstead, PhD. Would you like to comment on how the internet has fostered the science of addiction? Online activities are quantified to provide data that enables providers to make their digital products even more addictive.
That's absolutely right. And Carl, surveillance capitalism overlaps with limbic capitalism. I came at this historically, and I coined the expression limbic capitalism because I thought the sort of universal common denominator for this branch of capitalist enterprise was the way these products and services affected your limbic system. But other people are coming at this from the standpoint of surveillance capitalism. And what surveillance capitalism does through something like the internet and the profiles that it creates for internet users is it makes limbic capitalism even more efficient. People know your weaknesses and they target them.
Thank you. Here's one. In Bolivia and Peru, the farmer produces the coca plantation for both medicinal purposes and for, we wouldn't say recreational, but anyway, té de coca, coca tea. But the government has strong politics against this millennial tradition. What is your opinion on those things that are part of the tradition, but then the government just says, can't do that anymore. We're going to clamp down on you.
Well, my view of this is really that of an historian. In the book, I often use the expression food drugs. It's a mistake to impose our categories on the past. That, some things are foods and some things are drugs, and these are completely different kinds of things. And if you look at a substance like coca, you see that it's a food, it's a drug, it's important in rituals in many of these societies. And what happens as circumstances change and as pressures come from outside forces, outside actors like the United States, for example, with its drug war in the 1980s, you get changes in policies to regulate these particular foods and drugs. Personally, I've got nothing against somebody drinking coca tea. The problem is when it gets refined into coca paste and that gets turned into cocaine and that gets shipped to North American markets or other markets in Latin America, which, by the way, is another important theme in the book, is that not only do limbic capitalists make a product more seductive by blending it with other pleasures, they also refine it in a way that intensifies the brain reward that you receive from that product.
Well, my colleague, Dr. Catherine Neal Harris and I have talked about that with respect to Juul. Well, to vaping generally, but with Juul as a key example, not only in the way they figured out a way to make the nicotine hit harder, faster, and stronger. And then
put in fruity flavors while you're at it. I mean, you know, why not go for the trifecta here?
Well, and put on a fourth one. The way that in this report, Vaping Clearing the Air, on our website, we talk about how, particularly the Juul and the Philip Morris company, how they went after the youth. The particularly Juul, when they became really hit the market big, what a slick campaign it was, clearly aimed at people who wanted to be cool young teens.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually very frustrating to me. The book came out in May of 2019, just as the Juul scandal was sort of hitting the news. And, you know, I thought, darn, you know, there's another perfect illustration of what I was driving at here. And I'd gone ahead and written the book. But you know, unfortunately, given that technology and business innovation are the primary drivers here, there are more Juuls in our future. It's not going to stop with that.
I think you're right. Here's one that many people speak of the war on drugs as having failed, and we do that in the drug policy program at the Baker Institute. They argue that criminalization magnifies the harms of addicting substances. Do you agree with that? And can we combat the clear problem of limbic capitalism without resulting to criminalization?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, at some point, you have to be willing to use coercion if people don't follow the rules. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot to be said for decommercialization as opposed to prohibition. Look, you're always going to have people who get into trouble with potentially addictive substances. But there's a difference between that and mass addiction, such as we had with cigarette smoking after World War II. You know, why did that happen? Well, that had to do with the fact that you had an organized multinational industry which was really ingenious in its marketing of these products. And so I think that the foundation of any really rational public health approach starts with reining in marketing. That's really one key. Taxation, I think, is also an underutilized resource. This is another way that you can discourage consumption without legalizing it, and that is, to my mind, the really underdeveloped dimension of drug policy.
Yes, and when we talk about that in our program, we recognize that if it would be possible to legalize cannabis so that people who wanted to use it could get it legally, have enough, but it shouldn't be advertised. Perhaps it should be sold in ABC stores like it used to have for alcohol, that were very plain brown buildings. That'd be one. That's one approach that has been suggested as a way of just not commercializing it to the full.
Although it's important here to add something, which is that there's you have to be careful. This book, The Age of Addiction, is actually a sequel to a book I wrote that was just about drug history called Forces of Habit. And one of the things I noticed when I was writing Forces of Habit is that any time you jack up the tax too high, you get illicit black market activity anyway. I mean, people smuggle drugs and sell them in back alleys to avoid taxes. And in fact, prior to this anti-vice activism of the late 19th and early 20th century, far and away the most common reason for smuggling something like drugs was to avoid paying taxes. So taxes can be part of the answer, but you have to remember that as John Stuart Mill said, you can increase a tax to the point where it simply becomes a prohibition, and then you're going to have a black market.
Here's one that has to do with kind of a second order building on limbic capitalism. What do you have to say about the capitalization of rehabilitation centers used as drug diversion programs? And we might also add private prisons that criminal.
Yeah, no. Again, that is an excellent question. And in the eighth chapter of the book about policy, I talk about something called problem profits. So one person's externality is another person's gain. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to control limbic capitalism is that ultimately you get so many stakeholders, and it's not just the people who are making or marketing the product. It's these people who are deriving secondary or tertiary profits from these products by providing services like drug treatment or by manufacturing naloxone or whatever it is. In the book, I use the analogy of sucker fish on a shark. So limbic capitalism is the shark, and there are lots of sucker fish going along for the ride. And one of them is, unfortunately, and I don't mean to impugn good professionally run drug treatment programs, which do a lot of good, but there are some fly-by-night operations which have exploited this situation.
Here's an important question. How much does biology and genetics have to do with the likelihood of addiction in your?
It certainly plays a role. And in fact, in the third chapter and the sixth chapter of the book, I really look at how this debate has developed historically. And there's pretty good scientific evidence that there are genetic and epigenetic factors that make some people more vulnerable to certain kinds of addiction than others. Okay, and also that it's not typically just one addiction. So if you're more prone to compulsive gambling, then statistically you're also more likely to be a heavy drinker. There are multiple involvements. On the other hand, I think it's a myth simply to say, oh well, some people are born addicts and other people will be fine. That's not true either, because we know that social class is very important. We know that trauma early in life plays a role in susceptibility to addiction. And we know also that stress later in life, something like PTSD, can play a role in addiction formation. So the way I think about it is that you have a population, okay? And in this population, you have some people who are very susceptible, some people of average susceptibility, and some people who are low susceptibility. And they're probably going to be all right, even if they are occasionally exposed to these products. But as the exposure of that whole population increases, whether it's through legalized cannabis or the expansion of casino gambling or whatever it is, there are more people who are going to develop problems. And that's where the profits are for the industry. And to go back to the point that was raised earlier, it's easier through digital surveillance to identify who those prime targets are.
Good. Here's social media. I shouldn't have clicked it before. Can you see that? I clicked it before I was through reading with it. But anyway, it was about, well, I'm embarrassed by that. Here's another one. I'll try to find that one. It says, what, if any, was the relationship between the anti-alcohol and women's rights movement? Is it a coincidence that prohibition and universal suffrage were added to the Constitution at roughly the same time?
No, it is not a coincidence, and there was a very strong relationship. There was not only in the United States, but in other countries, educated, typically middle-class, reform-minded women played a very important role in the temperance movement. It's the fact that women can vote made a difference, not only in terms of national prohibition politics, but don't forget, even after repeal in the United States in 1933, many states and counties had prohibition laws, and generally women would be more strongly inclined to support those measures than men, partly for considerations of domestic violence, for example, or the fear that the working husband was going to drink up the paycheck and there wouldn't be enough to feed the family and pay the rent. This is a theme that runs through temperance literature and temperance propaganda going back centuries. Is the harm that it does to innocent others, especially women and children. And to my mind, this is the ultimate hot button issue. When you talk about drug policy, the thing that really gets people to go along with restriction and prohibition is the idea that these behaviors are doing harm to innocent others. I think most people are inclined to let people, if they're going to take 10 years off their lives, that's their business. But when it becomes a risk to others, then that's another story in terms of the policy and politics.
How do you reconcile the negative influences of addictive products with concerns over state regulation? And what sort of yardstick ought we use to determine what must be addressed by the state? That's from Jack Rohr.
Well, okay, so that's where the difference between the secular and the religious reformers comes in. In the 19th and the early 20th centuries, there were people who were fundamentally religious, and they weren't just Western. I mean, Gandhi, for example, was a famous anti-vice activist who was strongly opposed to tobacco and alcohol and gambling. Their criteria for deciding that something should be outlawed are fundamentally religious. If this is endangering your soul, if this is making you a worse person morally, the state has the duty to outlaw this. But what happens in terms of who controls anti-vice activism, there's a shift away from the purely religious outlook to a more secular public health outlook. And that outlook uses utilitarian reasoning to evaluate the wisdom of regulatory and prohibitive policies. So, I mean, you ultimately, a good example of that is the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 in the United States. You're familiar with the fact that has 5 schedules of controlled substances. Some are deemed to be so dangerous that we shouldn't use them for medicine at all. Others are deemed to be dangerous but therapeutically useful. We call those Schedule II drugs. And then you have Schedule III, Schedule IV, Schedule V, and so on. And those are less lightly regulated. And I know that there's controversy about whether something like cannabis should still be in Schedule I. But putting that issue to one side, that very idea of scheduling substances and regulating them in different ways is a perfect example of how you apply this kind of utilitarian thinking to policy. So that, all right, oxycodone is a Schedule II narcotic, and tramadol, that's not as addictive, so that we're not going to schedule that in as highly.
Okay. Here's one that is related to what you said, and if you think you've already covered it, okay, but I want it. Keith Humphrey says, in No Right Turn, so he's a fan of your work or knowledgeable about it, you document that over the past half century, the U.S. has moved right politically and moved left culturally. How has this unusual mix of forces affected the growth of limbic capitalism in the U.S.?
Well, okay, so this is, and a shout out to Keith, who by the way, was enormously helpful in stimulating my thinking about this book. So they go together. And this is just the old Weberian insight that the long-term consequences of capitalism are secularizing. And this also goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier about the secularizing influences of limbic capitalism. Commercialized vice leads to a more permissive society, almost by definition, all right? And in a book called No Right Turn, Conservative Politics in a Liberal America, I pointed to the paradox that in the late 20th century, Republicans were winning all kinds of elections. Ronald Reagan became president. You have the rise of the new right, conservative think tanks. It looks like conservatism politically is making a big comeback. But if you look at one of the central issues for American conservatives, that is the so-called culture war, and things like drug use or public acceptance of homosexuality or something like that, the culture was in fact moving the opposite direction, and very quickly so. And I think that limbic capitalism is one of the drivers for that continued drift toward permissiveness. Believe me, Las Vegas does not want American evangelical Protestants to win the culture war.
Here's one, from Jack Crosby. A significant increase in opioid addiction in Denver and nearby areas is being tied to the coronavirus pandemic. Is that happening elsewhere, or do you know if that's accurate?
Yes, and it's not necessarily an increase in new cases. It's more often an increase in relapse, because if people are confined, it's harder for them to get to treatment. They become depressed, anxious, cooped up, bored. I think it has more to do with relapse, but there's no question, based on the data that I've seen, that this was already a bad problem, and the coronavirus epidemic has made it worse, not only in terms of relapse, but in terms of people dying because they're isolated and there's no one who can administer life-saving drugs if they overdose.
This is going to be our last question here. It's from Cy Solarian. Are there any successful models in the world today of modern societies, communities, effectively managing the negative impacts of limbic capitalism at scale? If they do exist, what are their effective attributes and protocols? I think we still have time for you to answer that, but probably not quickly.
So I would go back to the example of the global campaign against cigarette smoking, and the fact that there are many elements to that. You have a mix of tax policy, international agreements, countries agreeing that they will limit the marketing of these products, crack down on smuggling of cigarettes that are manufactured legally but then enter into the black market. That has produced a measurable leveling off. So global per capita consumption of cigarettes was rising until relatively recently. And now, even in countries like China, where cigarette smoking was expanding very rapidly with modernization in the 1980s and 1990s, it's even starting to come down. So I would hold that up as a model. Although, if you think about it, the harms of tobacco smoking were pretty obvious, both to the individual and also through environmental tobacco smoke. You know, I wonder if we're going to do as well with something like social media and digital addictions, where perhaps the harms are less subtle and where the technology has become more integral to daily life.
Well, according to the old clock on the wall, excuse me, that was a flashback. According to the digital indicator at the top of my screen, it's time to bring the webinar to a close. But thank you, David, for an engaging presentation, and thank all of you who have joined us out there in webinar land. I urge you to develop a healthy addiction to Baker Institute publications, webinars, and at some point, live events by regularly checking the home website and also the websites of the individual programs, including, of course, the drug policy program, where you can sign up for our mailing list. So stay current, stay safe, and wear a mask. Good afternoon.